Hi, my name is Allan from Rational Realm. Welcome to this final part of a two-part series on Is Morality Subjective or Objective? This is a recording of my online address to Philosophy Matters on the 24th of March 2020. To find out more, visit the Rational Realm website at www.rationalrealm.com. The talk in February in this second part that I'm doing tonight is based on an essay I wrote back in 2015, and that was called Is Morality Subjective? And you can read that and download it from the ethics section of the Rational Realm website. Now, in that section is a number of other resources there. For example, I wrote a reply to my critics about what I'm about to talk about tonight. It's called Is Morality Subjective? A Reply to Critics. There are a couple of transcripts of similar talks that have a different slant on it for different audiences. One is called Is Morality a Matter of Taste? And that's mostly directed to people who are thinking that morality is not objective at all, it's completely subjective. And then I also have a transcript of a talk up there called Can Morality Be Objective Without God? And that is directed to people on the other side of the fence who think that morality is only objective and only objective because it's underpinned by a deity. So all of these papers here, you can download a PDF version from the ethics section of the website as well. So for those who don't know me, let me just say a little bit about my background. In the 1980s, I studied part-time at La Trobe University, and my main interests there were in ethics and epistemology. Epistemology is the philosophy of knowledge. And then about 4 years ago, I'm mostly retired from my career. My career was in organisational development and organisational capability. I'm just winding up the business now, and that's allowing me to get back to my two primary interests, which is philosophy and science, and it's allowed me to continue building up my Rational Realm website, and I'm putting new materials up there all of the time. So the URL for the website, of course, is in the handout as well. In the late 70s, early 1980s, I served on the Humanist Society of Victoria Committee. Well, short time as secretary, a longer time as vice president. And now, since I've been retired, I've got back onto the committee of the Humanist Society of Victoria. I've just recently stood down as vice president, but I'm continuing on as a committee member. So that's a little bit about me. Now, over these two sessions on Is Morality Subjective or Objective, my aim is to get over three key ideas, and it's these. The first one is that morality has both an important objective and an important subjective dimension, and thinking that it's either or is a mistake. The second idea is that there is a long and distinguished tradition in moral philosophy and religious ethics that sees objectivity in ethics as the requirement for impartiality. And the third idea is that what we learn from linguistic and philosophical analysis is that moral language also has a subjective expressive function, which is what I'll be talking about more tonight. But let's have a bit of a recap on part one that I did in February. So in part one, I introduced thinking about the nature of morality with a typical everyday moral argument. And we started by looking at a conversation about the morality of voluntary euthanasia between three friends, Fred, Mary and John. Now recall, if you were there, recall how Fred and Mary both gave reasons for their view based on considerations broader than their own personal wants and preferences. Whereas John, on the other hand, in simply referring to his own wants, was not offering a moral justification at all. Now, I use that conversation to illustrate an important point about the nature of moral reasoning, that for a reason to be a moral reason for doing something, it must be impartial and not simply appeal to the speaker's peculiar interests or the interests of their favoured group. This gives us an important clue about how ethics is necessarily objective. I went on to point out where not to look for this objective dimension in ethics by pointing out 4 failed programs. These failed programs looked for objectivity in some mind-independent or human-independent metaphysical realm. And these 4 failed programs we looked at last time are these. We looked at intuitionism, Kantian rationalism, natural law theory, and divine command theory. Now, their mistake, I argued, was in thinking that objectivity in ethics must be contrasted with subjectivity, where subjectivity is meant in the sense of being grounded in people's attitudes and preferences. But we know from the work done by moral philosophers that morality is somehow intimately grounded in people's attitudes and preferences. In saying that charity is good, for example, we are expressing a preference for a particular kind of action. Now, I summarise these 2 approaches to objectivity and subjectivity in ethics with this diagram. So this top line of the diagram illustrates what I think is the wrong approach. This approach sees being objective in moral judgments as tapping into some human independent realm of moral facts, untainted by personal preferences. This objective realm of human independent moral facts could be about God's commands or some natural law that binds us, or some non-natural property of things we intuit. I suggested that moral judgments do in fact express our attitudes and preferences. So this way of contrasting objectivity with subjectivity in ethics is mistaken, and that's why I put a big red cross next to this approach to ethics. Now, the bottom row. The bottom row of the diagram here illustrates this more helpful approach. On this approach, an objective moral judgment is one that is thoroughly impartial and avoids partisanship and self-serving bias. So when we accuse someone of being subjective in their moral reasoning, we are not calling them out for expressing their preferences and attitudes. We are accusing them of basing their moral judgments on their own selfish interests or on those of their favoured group. This then is how I think we properly contrast objectivity in ethics with subjective preferences. So I put a big green tick next to this alternative, more helpful approach. So on this approach, an objective moral judgment is a thoroughly impartial judgment that avoids partisanship and self-serving bias. On this approach, the central objective and subjective dimensions of ethics are properly identified by these 2 little green ticks that I've put next to subjective and objective. Now, I concluded the first part of my talk by warning against treating ethics as principally either objective or subjective, by urging us not to fall into this false dichotomy. Each has a central role to play in our moral lives. The subjective dimension encapsulates the human-centeredness of morality, its evolutionary underpinnings, and its historical grounding in social customs and contracts. The objective dimension, on the other hand, encapsulates the impartial nature of morality, how we appeal to reason and general principles, and our barring of partisan appeals. So, in this second part of my talk, I'll be saying more on the expressive function of moral language that gives it its subjective character. I'll then return to filling out the case that ethics is also importantly objective by looking at how objective is formally defined and how it is used in legal reasoning. I'll also review how the requirement for impartiality appears centrally in the 5 most prominent theories of ethics and in the long history of religious thinking on the subject. Okay, so let's talk now about the expressive function of moral language. Firstly, in what way does our moral language express our subjective preferences and attitudes? Recall the contrasting view. For these thinkers, our moral judgments are about a human independent realm that we can know about and in which our private personal feelings must play no part. These thinkers include the intuitionists, the Kantian rationalists, the natural law theorists, and the divine command theorists. And we briefly looked at those last time. For these thinkers, objectivity in ethics must be contrasted with subjectivity in this private feeling sense. They take subjectivity to mean being grounded in people's personal preferences and attitudes. Now, why is this a mistake? Because these thinkers ignore the central expressive function of moral language. When we say, for example, that charity is good, we are not simply describing the act of charity, we are also expressing our preference or our pro-attitude to charity. Think for a moment for someone who says, charity is good, but I don't really care for it one way or the other. Or someone who says, torturing innocent children for fun is abominably bad, but I'm not really fussed about it. How do you react to these statements? Now, we think these kinds of statements extremely odd. We feel that they've expressed some kind of practical contradiction. And here's another example of a practical contradiction. Saying out loud, I'm not talking. So I'm not talking is logically contradictory in itself, but expressing it is giving way to a practical contradiction. So in the same way, I'm saying these express a practical contradiction. And that is because that in saying that something is good or bad, we are expressing our preference or aversion to it. Now, there are many words such as this in the English language that have this central expressive meaning, such as hero and villain. Both of these are value-laden, expressing a particular preference. Other examples of words with emotive meaning include these: chaste, whore, nigger, patriot. So when someone calls a woman a whore, they are describing her as a person who has many sexual relations. However, the speaker is also expressing their disgust, their con attitude to the woman's sexual preferences. The word whore is richly value-laden. It has emotive meaning in addition to its descriptive meaning. And I've specified those two components, those two meanings in the word there. The word chaste, likewise, describes a person's sexual activities. In this case, the lack of them. The emotive meaning in this example of chaste is the expression of the speaker's approval or pro-attitude to the chaste person's sexual status. Now, some pairs of words can have the same descriptive meaning while having the exact opposite meaning. And I want to put this to you. Can you think of an opposite to the word whore? So where the word whore is describing the person as having many sexual relations and expressing a disapproval, is there a word that has the same descriptive content, many sexual relations, but is expressing approval? Can anyone think of that kind of value-laden word that's opposite? No? What about chaste? When we say that someone's chaste, we're saying that they have no sexual relations, but it's expressing a pro-attitude. We're expressing approval of the person's way of living. What means the same as chaste, but is expressing a disapproval? Frigid. Oh, great. I haven't thought of that one. Can someone think of another one? Actually, frigid is better than the one I had down here. The other one, which is not as good as frigid, is prude. Now, with whore, which has a negative connotation, the opposite that I thought of was liberated. So back in the 60s and 70s with the women's liberation movement, to describe a woman as liberated would be condoning or allowing for many sexual relations. So there's a pair of words there, whore and liberated, that have opposite emotive connotations but the same descriptive content. Another pair of words with emotive meaning is hero and coward. Both words describe a person's response to danger or risk, but in this example, the word hero expresses approval of the person's actions, while the word coward expresses disapproval. So what I'm saying here is that the words good and bad, right and wrong have the same kind of emotive meaning. They serve to express the speaker's approval or disapproval of whatever they're labelling as good or bad, right and wrong. Now, it's important to note here that in expressing our approval and disapproval when we use moral language, we are not stating that we approve or disapprove. that would simply be adding to the description of the thing we are describing. It would be adding a description of our own psychological state. That would be making the same kind of mistake that naive moral subjectivists make. In saying that charity is good, for example, we are expressing our attitude in the same kind of way that we express other kinds of things when we speak. So, for example, when I say that charity is rare, I'm expressing my belief and not simply stating that I believe that the proposition charity is rare. So it's important to get this distinction between the descriptive meaning, the descriptive component of a word, and its emotive meaning. If you want to follow up more on this, the seminal work was back in the 1940s. C.L. Stevenson, Charles Stevenson's Ethics and Language, in his later work, 1967, Facts and Values, and the work has been continued on by the moral philosophers who are now called the expressivists. Back then it was called sophisticated emotivism. So, okay, I've given a brief account of the subjective, expressive nature of our moral language. I'm also arguing that ethics has a central objective dimension. I'm saying that moral judgments are judgments that strive to be non-partisan, that try to be impartial. I want to come now to an objection to this view of moral objectivity. Some have said that I've misappropriated the word objective to suit my own philosophical position. Some have pointed to the standard meaning of objective as being external to the mind. Now let me make this point. It's true that all of the major dictionaries give a central sense of the word objective as pertaining to things external to the mind. I accept this. However, all of the major dictionaries list a second central meaning of the term impartial and unbiased. Here I can point you to the British Dictionary, the Penguin-Macquarie Dictionary, and the Merriam-Webster's Dictionary. So I'll just quote from Merriam-Webster's Dictionary. It gives this sense of objective as, and I quote, fair, just, equitable, impartial, unbiased, dispassionate. Objective mean free from favour toward either or any side. Objective stresses a tendency to view events or persons as apart from oneself and one's own interest or feelings. And it gives an example. I can't be objective about my own child. Now, it's precisely in this sense that our laws are held to the ideal of being applied objectively. Consider Our Lady Justice, who sits outside many of our courthouses. Notice how she sports a blindfold. Now, Wikipedia has a good summary of what that blindfold represents. If you look up the Wikipedia entry on Lady Justice, I quote it here. The blindfold represents objectivity in that justice is or should be meted out objectively, without fear or favour, regardless of money, wealth, fame, power or identity, blind justice and impartiality. Let me also give you a couple of examples in common discourse. We sometimes ask people to be objective in this sense of being impartial as they think through making an important decision. Here are two examples. Firstly, a good friend of ours is contemplating whether to accept a marriage proposal. Another example, our neighbour is working through how to distribute her worldly goods after she dies. In these circumstances, we advise our friend and neighbour to think objectively about their decision. Now, of course, we aren't appealing to some metaphysical realm of objective transcendent truths. We are asking them to reflect on their most settled and important preferences and to not be swayed by short-term feelings that will prejudice the outcomes they want. It is in this sense of impartiality I say that ethics is objective. Okay, I want to talk now about this idea of impartiality as it has appeared throughout the history of moral philosophy and religious conceptions of justice. Now, this is not a new idea. There is a strong philosophical tradition in incorporating this notion of impartiality as essential to the nature of ethics. And here are 5 prominent examples. David Hume, a very, very prominent Enlightenment philosopher, and I draw on his ideal observer theory. He didn't think up the ideal observer theory. There are a couple of minor precursors to that. But for David Hume, when we make moral judgments, we are trying to stand in the shoes of a dispassionate observer, without regard for self and our own particular social group. Even though our judgments are fundamentally based on sentiment, that is, personal feelings, they are formulated from what he called a general point of view. Now, Henry Sidgwick, writing some 100 years later, called this the point of view of the universe. Another prominent Enlightenment philosopher, Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. Kant tried to capture this idea of universality in his categorical imperative. This was his notion that a moral rule necessarily must be such that it is willed for all, that it be universally applied. Third example, Richard Hare, modern-day philosopher, with his prescriptivism. Now, Richard Hare built into his theory of universal prescriptivism the idea that moral judgments are prescriptions that we want to apply to everyone. Going back to the Enlightenment, Henry Sidgwick with his utilitarianism. Sidgwick and other prominent utilitarians such as John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, encapsulated moral objectivity with their principle of impartiality. This famous principle is translated as a requirement for the equal consideration of all interests. And the last example I have today is John Rawls, another contemporary philosopher who also unfortunately died in 2002, and his social contract theory. He wrote a massive work called A Theory of Justice, which is really now a classic in moral philosophy. So John Rawls, refining the work of earlier social constructivists like Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Rawls put the requirement for impartiality at the centre of his view of the social contract. For Rawls, our moral norms are rules agreed upon by actors communicating behind a veil of ignorance about one's wealth, gender, nationality, all of those things that make you the particular individual that you are. Now, in addition to the significance and influence of these 5 giants in moral philosophy, a case can also be made for the preeminence of this concept of impartiality in the thinking of the founders of the major religions of the world. In many religions, God is seen as the impartial judge. Consider, for example, the 3 Abrahamic religions. Judaism, and this is from Ezekiel chapter 18. Therefore I will judge you, O house of Israel, each according to his conduct, declares the Lord God. In Christianity, and I take this from Paul, 2 Corinthians, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive his due for the things done in the body, whether good or bad. The third example is Islam. This is from Quran, chapter 2. And be conscious of the day on which you shall be brought back unto God, whereupon every human being shall be repaid in full for what he has earned, and none shall be wronged. Now note how in these 3 religions, dispensing justice is about the nature of the deeds done, untainted by consideration of the judged person's particulars, for example, their gender, their heritage, ethnic origin, position in society. The Golden Rule is another excellent example of how this requirement for impartiality is embedded into our most central moral maxims. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you is the maxim expressed by all of the major religious and non-religious worldviews when they are at their noblest. And we can find this maximum of the Golden Rule going back to the most ancient civilizations. We can find it in ancient Egypt, ancient India, ancient Greece, Hinduism, Taoism, Confucianism, and you can see there the references to where the Golden Rule is explicitly expounded. Now we can also find the Golden Rule expressed in these more modern religions: Buddhism, Baha'i, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and there again you can find the references to where the Golden Rule is expounded. Now this is in, you'll find these references in I think one of the transcripts of my talks, if you go to the Rational Realm website, I'm just trying to think of where I've got these references if you want to check them out. You can certainly email me and I can give them to you. Scarborough Missions has produced a wonderful poster that you can download that illustrates well this commonality of the Golden Rule to all of these different worldviews. And there's the URL there. I'm fortunate enough to have a card version of it, which makes for good for teaching and instructing. So you can download it and then print it out on good quality cardboard, or I think you can get them to send one to you. But it's a really good summary of how the Golden Rule spans all of these major worldviews and religions. Now note how this universalist maxim makes no reference to God and is intuitively compelling as a way of guiding action for people of widely varying cultures and times. If you're going to expect others to consider your interests, then treat them with the same consideration. How can you expect any different? In dealing with others, your interests do not count for any more or less just because of who you are. For all of these key philosophical and religious traditions, this is the principle of impartiality that is at the core of what it means to act ethically. So I want to wrap up this second part of my talk now. So let me summarise what I've tried to show during these two sessions. I started with a scenario of three friends discussing the ethics of voluntary euthanasia. I used this scenario to illustrate where the notion of impartiality fits in our everyday moral reasoning. Next, I suggested that it is this requirement for impartiality that constitutes the objective dimension of morality and not some discernment of human independent facts. I then properly contrasted this important sense of objectivity in moral reasoning with its subjective antithesis, that of offering self-serving, parochial or biased reasons. In today's talk, I delve deeper into the sense in which ethics is unavoidably subjective, that is, in the sense that our moral judgments express our deep-seated preferences. In defending the view that ethics is also objective, I went on to consider the objection that I have misappropriated the label objective. Finally, I offered examples showing how objectivity in the sense of impartiality has a long and distinguished tradition in both moral philosophy and religious ethics. Now, to find out more, I encourage you to check out my original short essay and my reply to critics and the transcripts of my earlier talk, which you can find in the ethics section of the Rational Realm website. So thank you again for taking the time to listen to what I had to say, and now I'm very interested in hearing what you have to say, getting your feedback and what you think. Thank you. This recording was produced by Allan on the 1st of June 2020. To access other talks and essays, visit the Rational Realm website at www.rationalrealm.com. For the latest news, visit the Rational Realm Facebook page. Our Twitter handle is @RationalRealm.